Hello, friends. First up, I have a confession to make. I'm a repeat offender. Go ahead and judge me. God knows I've done it often enough myself, and I don't mind. But ask yourself this: can you honestly say with complete confidence that would never happen to me? You see, the truth is that it's surprisingly easy to do. You have an abusive relationship, survive it, rebuild your life and forget all about it, or try to. Then sometime later you fall in love with the wrong person again, and off you go on repeat. At some point in the second relationship, you realize you've been here before, and you blame yourself. I'm a bad picker is how I used to explain it if anyone asked, as though it was my fault. But it wasn't. It was just that I didn't understand how abuse works, and I didn't recognize the signs, the clues, the behavior, or the type. Why was that? Because I never talked about it. Nobody ever talked about it. Nothing was written about it. In the road atlas of relationships, there were no signposts with a big red triangle screaming danger. And because of that, domestic abuse was able to hide in plain sight. It was there right in front of us the whole time. Here's what happened to me. If you've been there yourself, then I bet a fiver to a large clock you'll recognize 90% of what I'm about to describe. For 15 years, I was married to a controlling, abusive man, and we had 3 children together. I'm not talking about the kind of abuse where he'd come home drunk on a Saturday night and bounce me off the furniture, but the kind where I had no control over my own life. A lot of the time we were happy, and those were the times that meant I could live with the rest of it. People who knew us acknowledged that he was sometimes difficult, but it was easy to turn a blind eye because he could also be funny and charming and really good company. And he came from a good, wealthy family. We had a lot of fun, as long as we had fun his way and did what he wanted. Our family life was all about him. If he sulked or lost his temper, we would say, "Oh, it's just him being him," as though that excused it. Then one warm July night, I decided I couldn't do it anymore and told him I no longer loved him, and he threw me out. At 2:30 in the morning, he made me say goodbye to my sleeping daughters. The youngest was 5. Took my car keys, my wedding ring, and my child benefit book from me and kicked me out of the door. And then he took everything else: my home, my self-respect, my possessions, confidence, and worst of all, my children. It took me 3 years of fighting through the courts to get them back again. And during that time, they were my motivation to pick myself up and rebuild my life. Once they came to live with me, my ex-husband, who had remarried, cut us off for the next 8 years, more or less. He paid £20 a month in support and occasionally reminded us he was around by driving past the house, but we never spoke. The last conversation I had was to arrange for him to see the girls. He never showed up. Several years later, I was going through another really stressful time, but I wasn't without hope. Experience had taught me I was strong and would get through it eventually. I was on antidepressants, but for the most part I was happy, a high-functioning depressive. And then I met Frank. Mutual friends set us up on a blind date because they thought we were both a bit lonely and fed up. He was tall, good-looking, a little younger than me, and French. He seemed quite distant and intriguing, enigmatic and mysterious. The married friend who introduced us proudly called him my Frank, as though he belonged to her. That was the effect he had on women. To be on the receiving end of his interest was incredibly flattering. To be with him felt like being in sunshine again after months of rain. I remember that first date well. It was Halloween. I know. When he relaxed a bit, Frank was funny and charming. He was a company director and drove a nice car. We might call him old-fashioned in that he took charge, opened doors, looked after me in a slightly formal way, that sort of thing. There were 2 things I particularly remember from that night. The first was that we went to a club, and when he came back from fetching our coats, I was chatting to another man. "I can't leave you alone for a moment," teased Frank, which made me feel both attractive and protected. And then, when we went our separate ways, I offered him my phone number. He said no. That's French for no. You, he said, will call me, and he gave me his, which was irritating because, and this makes what follows even more surprising, I don't like being told what to do. The signs, subtle though they were there. I even had a flash of premonition when a thought unbidden popped into my head, and that thought said, "This man will break your heart." I told myself I wouldn't let him. I lasted 3 days before I phoned him because that little taste of frank sunshine had me hooked and I wanted more. Over the next couple of months, he love-bombed me. He took me out to dinner. He bought me new clothes. Well, mine were getting a bit shabby, he said. He took me away for the weekend. He told me he had a fiancée in Paris, but that he loved me, not her. But he still spent Christmas with her. And then we began living together. It seemed as though this happened for very good reasons, but they're too complicated to go into here, as is the skillful way he separated me from my family and friends. Whenever I think of this, I think of the Serengeti and the way a prowling lion will separate the weakest from the herd for the kill. And this is the thing with coercive control and domestic abuse. It's slippery and hard to describe, and because at the beginning everything is a head-spinning whirlwind of all that we've ever hoped for, read about, or seen in a film, we could ignore all the little clues that might otherwise make us pause and think, hang on. I'll explain what I mean. When I decided to write my book, Look What You Made Me Do, I had something unique in my possession. I had an archive of all the letters and notes Frank and I ever wrote to each other, and we wrote to each other a lot. What this gave me was the authentic voice of my lover, my abuser. And when I sorted it all out and put it in date order, it told our story from both sides and revealed the pattern that I now know is present in almost every single abusive, controlling relationship. It's striking how similar survivors' experiences are. This is a letter Frank wrote to me when we'd been together for a couple of years. This letter meant so much to me that I carried it around for a very long time. That's why it's tattered and worn and faded. Here's the opening line. It was not love at first sight. Before you had finished to say hello, your hand in mine, I was already in love with you. He goes on. You are right to say that the fact you needed someone to help you in some way attracted me even more. I have never felt before what I felt for you. I just could not stay away from you. Is that a love letter? Certainly sounds like a love letter. I thought it was. I thought our letters and my diaries told the story of the love of my life, until a couple of years ago when I read them with a clear head and saw them that they were, in fact, a sequence of classic Frank shit sandwiches. The declarations of his love for me, the accusations that I was torturing him by withholding my love, the promise of a golden future together, then the implication that I was clearly not in my right mind, that I was mad, unpredictable, useless, immature, and incapable of loving him, and after all he'd done for me. I feel betrayed, he wrote. I hope the real Helen takes control. P.S. I forgot to tell you how beautiful you are. By then, at various times, I had been punched, thrown into a wall, dragged by my hair, and strangled to the point of unconsciousness. He made repeated efforts to get control of my bank account, not that there was much in it, because I was spending it all on keeping him happy. He explained that he wanted to manage it for me, because, he said, I was hopeless with money. He isolated me and stalked me whenever I went anywhere without him, and I only ever did that with his permission. He kept me in a state of such exhaustion and anxiety that I was on the point of losing the job I loved. And yet here he was telling me that he loved me more than life itself, and he was only trying to help me. I was desperate for someone to help me, but I didn't know how to ask or to explain what was wrong. To outsiders, he gave the impression of being a very caring man with a nightmare girlfriend. Frank wanted to be the only person I ever asked for anything, but his help had changed the way I dressed, what I ate, how I spoke, who I saw, what I read, what I wrote, how I answered the phone, and even how I stood, walked, and breathed. It should be up and down, apparently, whereas I breathed in and out. His help had taken me from a dress size 10 to a size 6 through the diet and exercise programs he devised for me. But to tell him to stop telling me to do that was dangerous. I'd tried before and I no longer had the courage to do it. But I also needed him in the same way an addict needs their next fix. I learnt that it's possible to love someone and be afraid of them at the same time in the same moment. All it took was the sound of Frank's voice or a look. So what about the people around us, the friends and family I'd been cut off from, the people who'd introduced us in the first place and knew him well? What about the people in the street who would have witnessed behaviour that made them uncomfortable? Or my work colleagues? What would the people who knew us, who knew me, have seen? They would have seen us standing outside a city centre hairdresser one sunny afternoon. I was half an hour late coming out, the hairdresser's fault, not mine. And Frank was hitting me on the top of my expensively cut and coloured hair with a rolled-up magazine, saying, "Don't, thwack, you, thwack, ever, thwack, do that, thwack, to me, thwack, again." Extra hard thwack for emphasis. People looked, of course they did, but I was smiling, laughing almost, only because I didn't know what else to do. If they'd looked properly, they would have seen I was on the point of tears and scarlet with humiliation. At dinner out with my colleagues, they would have seen me abruptly change from chatty and laughing to nervy and silent, when through the large restaurant window I spotted the tall man with his back to us. They would have seen me check my phone and leave the table to go through the dozens of texts and voicemails asking where I was. He knew where I was. He was outside on the pavement. Shakily, I made my excuses and left early. Then they would have seen that man reach out and grab my throat as I smiled and walked towards him. People who passed us as we walked home would have seen him gripping the back of my neck and hurrying me along, too fast for the heels I was wearing. I stumbled and almost fell. Our neighbours in the flats where we lived would have heard loud noises and a scream. My line manager might have wondered why a woman who had worked efficiently and well for 8 years suddenly changed out of all recognition, and why she was late 63 times in 5 months. They might have wondered why I had begun to wear scarves, and once someone did ask me about the bruises on my neck, but that was the only time. No one considered any of that when they took disciplinary action and decided to sack me. Not even my union rep. With no income, I was forced into further dependence on Frank. What about the man in the gym who asked me if everything was okay while Frank was there, pushing me through 200 abdominal crunches and making me repeat every one I got wrong? He asked, I said I was fine, that was it. What about my friends? That was simple, I lied my socks off. Not telling the truth was as easy as lying to myself about Frank. When I wrote the book, I had to explain that. Then I had to deal with their guilt because they hadn't seen what was right in front of them. But how could they when we're all of us so good at not seeing? And when our abusers are so good at slipping what we thought we saw away out of sight? Look at that, not at this. I could quote statistics at you until I'm blue in the face. 56% of abused women arrive late for work at least 5 times a month. Domestic abuse costs UK businesses in excess of 2.7 billion a year. That fewer than 1 in 3 who experience domestic violence discuss that violence with anyone, but that the same number think that their friends and colleagues are aware of the violence anyway. That the main reason given for remaining silent is shame. Funny that we don't mention the fear of reprisal if we do talk about it, and the terror when someone asks within earshot. Shame is a persuasive silencer, but it is our shame. We own it. When that shame is coupled with the fear gifted to you by the man you have chosen to love, it becomes a lethal gag. But the signs are there, the clues are there. If you have the smallest doubt about yourself or a friend, neighbour, colleague, someone you walk past in the street, your grandmother or your own child, call a helpline and get advice. If it's safe, let them know you're there for them and keep letting them know, because it takes time to recognise the exit. Just please, please, don't ignore it, or worse, reinforce the lie by walking away. Thank you for listening.